Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of our lecture. We were just talking about the TV series 24 and we were talking about how TV shows like that and Battlestar Galactica, as well as perhaps the new movie Zero Dark 30 have sort of raised controversies because it's understood by many critics that these movies and these TV shows suggest that torture is somehow useful or ethical in certain situations, and many people dispute that assertion because they believe that it's contradictory to American values since the founding of the country, which is that the country is based on laws, and what makes the country what it is its respect for the law, and that many of these policies clearly violate established law, whether it's international law or American law. So we have that to consider and that to reflect on. But we're specifically talking about ethics in this lecture, and I'm trying to stitch together this discussion that we've started off with ethics as a kind of having a problem, much the same way as last week science had a problem when we were thinking about a science of politics. This week we're thinking about, much in the same breath, a truth of ethics. And of course, truth of ethics is subject to this question of whether or not we're approaching the question in a completely neutral and arbitrary way that allows us to have a value neutral stance, i.e. an external stance to the situation. Last week when we were talking about politics and we talked about racism and sexism in politics, for example, that women were prevented from being part of politics, we invoked the example of Aristotle's famous suggestion that women had no place in politics, and that, we argued, had centuries and centuries lifespan of an idea, in millennia in fact. Here similarly, ethics raises the same question. Is there an ethical standpoint that is neutral, that is somehow removed from the problem? And our suspicion, I think, is that perhaps that's not true, that no ethics comes without a problem to be solved on the part of the person who's doing the theorizing, which means effectively that there's a bias. And when we think about TTBS, or ticking time bomb scenario, precisely that bias is there again. Just think of the very idea that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Of course, nothing is quite so simple. So let's just look quickly at the two simple ethical propositions of TTBS in the box here. The first one being that all we need to think about is the rational calculation of greater utility. It's, after all, a utilitarian perspective, as I said in the last section. We have the value of prohibition of torture, which is a nice thing to have, but sometimes it's more valuable to save lives, we think. So therefore, on a simple cost-benefit analysis, it seems just more useful to us to save more lives than to reduce the harm or hurt to just one person. And then the second point there that I think is even more interesting is this idea that the terrorist is simply a bad guy and that he has no real sort of values of his own, that he is sort of a Darth Vader type person or a Dr. Evil type person, and that he has no real agenda other than to cause harm and to cause destruction. And that's a problematic argument, I think, because it's reductive. And what do I mean by reductive? I mean, it sort of reduces our enemy to a simple, sort of almost robotic motivation structure, that his personality is very simple. We don't think about his history. We don't think about his background or her background. We don't think about what they've been through, the emotional experiences of their lives, the frustrations, the hardships that have put them in the situation where they feel compelled to behave the way they are behaving today. So in real life, then, what I want to suggest is something perhaps a little bit controversial, because I know this generally doesn't go down well in a sort of a historical context where we see Americans going around with a sticker, for example, support our troops, that kind of thing. And I'm not really making a comment in that regards. I want to sort of put that on the shelf for a minute, because this is not necessarily a partisan remark, it's a theoretical remark. But I simply just want to say that against, for example, TV type scenarios where Jack Bauer or in Battlestar Galactica or other shows, there's clearly a good guy and a bad guy. In real life, it's not really clear that there are good guys or bad guys. There are definitely enemies, and we can recognize opposing forces and opposing agendas. But to say that there are good guys and bad guys is a bit simplistic. For example, in that sense, then what I would probably be doing is I would be disagreeing to a certain extent with George Bush, who said, the problem is that there are evildoers out there who are hell-bent on destroying our way of life. Actually, when we look more closely at the political statements of Islamic terrorists, for example, we find much more complexity there than a simple desire to attack our way of life or what have you. In fact, if anything, they are not interested in attacking our way of life at all. They are interested in a political situation that exists more specifically in the Middle East. So Osama bin Laden has the desire to establish and empower a dominion, if you will, of Islamic law, a Sharia law, that stretches from Morocco, say, through the Middle East and into the Far East. But that's not necessarily a global agenda per se, and certainly it's not one that would necessarily be rooted in a simplistic sort of Darth Vader-like desire to destroy our goodness or whatever have you. It's a geopolitical agenda. It's a geopolitical rationale. It doesn't necessarily have that simplistic hatred behind it that is imputed to it by such simplistic statements as George Bush's idea that they're evildoers. Certainly from their point of view, they're not evildoers. They believe that they are doing God's will and that they are the righteous, and we are in fact perhaps the evildoers. So this kind of idea of just throwing this idea at each other that you're just the bad guys or what have you, tends to be very reductive. In that sense, real life is not like the TV shows. There aren't good guys and bad guys. People don't simply want to fight with us. They have a politics. So what I want to suggest is that thinking this way, giving our enemies the benefit of the doubt, if you will, politically speaking at least, that's not to say we have to agree with what they're putting forward. Far from it. I'm not for a minute suggesting that. We can disagree. We can disagree violently. I'm not making a comment in that regards at all. But I am suggesting that we do have to think about our enemies' politics, whether we like it or we don't like it. So this certainly would make us more likely, I think, to pause before we simply torture someone as the enemy or the bad guy. So that's something to think about. And again, it also bears reflection on who we are and what we want to be and the values we want to sort of preserve in ourselves before we will stoop in a way to compromise on our values in our pursuit of our political goals. So is it ethical to use violence then to make the world a better place? I guess what we want to do here is we want to expand from the simple, narrow, ticking time bomb question, the question of torture, and the question of an ethical framing or an ethical argument in favor of torture, to a broader argument about how ethics and ethical positions can motivate very divergent attitudes towards all manner of policies. And if you remember from the start of the last part of the lecture, we suggested, citing Veronique Pinfat, the author of the chapter that we're principally reading, that ethics is the question of how we should live with the other people in the world. How we should live with the other people in the world. There are very, very different ways of framing that question or answering that question. And so we should probably, I just quickly want to look at two of those now. And remember, we're stepping back from the question of torture here to look at a bigger, more global analysis. So we start off with the communitarian framework or theory of Michael Walzer. And Walzer has made a name for himself as a communitarian theorist. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that he believes that each community on the planet has its own basic standards of justice. And it's kind of one of these ideas, I suppose, that, look, in America and in the Western world, we have evolved a certain set of values, and other people in other parts of the world have evolved different values. And we're never going to get agreement between them and us on what those values should be in a universal sense. So hence he argues, and here's the key quote on the slide, our common humanity, just because we're all human beings, will never make us members of a single universal tribe. Just because we're all human doesn't mean we're all going to agree all the time. So what does this imply then in terms of an ethical disposition towards engaging with the world? Well, just as with the ticking time bomb scenario, there's a framing there that sets a standard of intervention, and for Michael Walzer, that standard is very, very high. He is very, very hesitant to intervene in the world. So, for example, should we be seeking to intervene to overthrow dictators in other countries? He would argue only rarely, because states have an obligation to fit only their own community's standard of behavior. So, what does it mean to fit? It means that that we as foreigners, before we want to intervene, should look at the values of the community and look at the values of the government there and see if they fit together. And if there's a very obvious contradiction between those values, then maybe we could intervene. But otherwise we have no business doing so, he's suggesting. So this lack of a fit, he says, has to be radically apparent before we would make such an intervention. So there's quite a high standard there that he's suggesting before we would intervene. Now I want to contrast Walzer's view here with the view of Charles Beitz, who we see in the next slide here. And Beitz is saying, and I think the important thing here is that Beitz, unlike Walzer, is saying rather than sort of starting with this idea that we're members of a community first, Beitz is suggesting that we are members of a global species called human beings, and that we are subjects as such. That before we're members of a community, we're individuals with a certain rationality, with a certain right to be free, a certain autonomy, and that gives us rights, a whole panoply of rights, in fact. So out of this sort of starting position, he suggests that there is a possibility of an ideal theory of justice, where you could imagine an ideal theory that would be applicable to every single human being on the planet, starting from what he calls this global original position. And so if we take that idea as a sort of a starting point for him, the question is, well, what would a reasonable world order look like that would respect the rationality of every human being and the right of autonomy of every human being? This is what we should be striving for, the achievement of this reasonable world order. And in which case then, for Beitz, the standard of intervention is substantially lower than for Walzer. We will be intervening on a more frequent basis from Beitz's point of view. So the bottom line is for Beitz, where there are rights, where you see a community with rights, there are obligations there. We have obligations towards each other in order to keep justice secure. It sort of echoes the President Woodrow Wilson on the eve of his intervention in World War I, saying we are going to go into Europe, this is World War I, remember, in order to, and I quote, make the world safe for democracy. Similarly, Charles Beitz is putting forward that very sort of quintessentially liberal position, but he calls his theory cosmopolitanism. And the idea of cosmopolitanism there is interesting. Of course, we all know the name and the title of Cosmo magazine, Cosmopolitan magazine. That's not really where we're coming from here. We're not talking about high street fashion. We're talking about the ideal of a cosmopolitan encounter. That is the meeting of people who are different, but the respect that those different people will have for each other in that encounter is very, very important. Even in the international realm. So that's where Beitz is coming from, this cosmopolitan perspective. So in the next slide we do a little sort of cross comparison of these two thinkers. And I'll move through this quickly. We have on the one hand Walzer showing us the basis for his standard of reason. Remember we said that it was quite a high standard if we are going to intervene. He's saying that reason is not global, but it's community-based, and that does establish a very high standard for intervention. So where do we find the justification for a moral position in relation to that? Who is the moral subject that we're looking at to sort of preserve, which has rights that need to be preserved? For Walzer, it is the political community of each state. They're entitled to make standards as they wish, and it's not our business to intervene or interfere in those. So the space, the space of politics, if you will, that delimits where the discussion takes place about ethics is within that state, and that's very, very important for Walzer. And it means, for example, that a lot of the intervention that Western governments sort of carry out right now would not be well founded in his standard of justice. Whereas Beitz, on the other hand, is saying, no, in fact, there is a global space, there's a global ethical space, and every human being is entitled to ethics because we're all member of a global humanity. And if we're not respecting each other as human beings first and foremost, then we're not satisfying our obligations to each other. So the important point here then is, for Walzer, we are only rarely going to intervene. For Beitz, because like Woodrow Wilson, he believes in making the world safe for democracy and safe for standards of justice that are much more comprehensive, and we will be intervening on a more frequent basis. Now, Veronique Pinfat, in her chapter, and I want to sort of drill down on this because it'll be important as a question on this in terms of the exam, she is a little bit suspicious, I think, of both of those two theories that we've just been looking at. She would argue, she believes that that these theories, to a certain extent, they're expensive, right? And what do we mean expensive? They're not so much that they're expensive in terms of money or even resources, although that might be true. They're expensive to us in terms of what they allow us to see in the world. They make us focus on one thing at the expense of the other thing. Now, I'm sure that you there sitting at home watching your computer can think of scenarios where both of those theories might actually be wrong. So, for example, there are times where we might side with Walzer that we want to entitle a community with its own standards of justice, and there might be other times where we say, in fact, no, that there are also global standards of justice that need to be respected. And the question is to sort of try to get into the specifics of each case, rather than generalities of each case, because I think that's the problem Veronique Pinfat is suggesting is that exists with these theories, is that they're always talking about generalities and never specifics. They're always looking for the overarching law or the overarching rule without thinking about specific histories, specific scenarios, backgrounds, etc. And so she recruits the philosopher who's a long time passed away now, Ludwig Wittgenstein, to try to make an argument about why these theories are expensive. And so she challenges ethics on the basis of this, much like we were challenging political science last week. So what does Wittgenstein suggest that might be useful here? Well, his primary concept is that is this idea of the correspondence theory of truth, and that is the idea that reality exists independently of any thoughts or words we have about it. Now, pause for a minute there and just think about what we were saying last week. Isn't that exactly the same thing that we were saying last week? That, when we looked at the Gestalt diagrams, we knew that if we looked at them one way, we saw one picture. If we looked at it another way, we saw another picture. And the important thing there was that not so much that one picture was more true than the other, right? But that to transition between the two pictures, it took our minds, and we discussed some artists that gave us visual experiments to try to solicit that kind of thinking from us, which is very useful. That sort of dexterity and flexibility in our minds to transition between different approaches in truth is very, very useful, and something I think we should be focusing on in this class, and we will be as we continue in the coming weeks. But Wittgenstein's very, therefore, critical of the idea that there's one truth. He suggests that, much like those images that we were looking at, the Gestalt images, that seeing one truth implies being stuck in a kind of a language, or what he calls a language game. And you can sacrifice a lot of mental flexibility by getting stuck in those language games. So what does Wittgenstein mean here? Can we give that a concrete example? Well, he might be saying, for example, that how you think about people in general suggests how you will act in relation to them. If you think certain types of militants are terrorists and you categorize them as such, you'll act harshly towards them, whereas others you might classify as freedom fighters, and even though they rely on very similar strategies, they somehow get absolved of responsibility for those strategies in ways that you didn't allow for the terrorists. So, for example, after 9/11, the IRA terrorists in the north of Ireland got a kind of a free pass in relation to the war on terror, which surprised many people. And similarly, if we go back to Nicaragua during the Ronald Reagan administration, we saw that President Reagan was very willing to brand the anti-communist Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua as freedom fighters, whereas a lot of people living there would have seen the policies that they were pursuing as very terroristic indeed, with death squads and such roaming around the countryside. And indeed, many people in Nicaragua today are still preoccupied with trying to find out where their nearest and dearest disappeared to during those times. Yet Reagan believed that these people were freedom fighters. So there's a lot at stake in that idea, I think, and it's useful for us to try to, again, with that Gestalt attitude, switching between truths, to understand the need for a dexterity of our mind. Not that we're ever going to find out one truth, but that there's importantly different truths out there, and seeing things simplistically is often very dangerous. Maybe not for us, but certainly for the people we're intervening against, or for the people on the other side of the divide that we're supporting here. So, lives can be lost as a result of these maneuvers, and it's a lot of responsibility comes with that. So if we're going to challenge the ethics of the ticking time bomb scenario now, coming back full circle, having discussed our ethics and having discussed Wittgenstein, we now are in a position to think about how Wittgenstein and his argument in favor of intellectual dexterity allows us to think about language games, and specifically the ticking time bomb scenario as a language game. So if we remember that language games tell us what it is possible to do and how it is possible to exist and act in the world, according to Veronique Pinfat, then we see that the language of ethics has a certain power, just as the language of political science had a certain power last week to cause us to act one way or to act another way. So if we consider then the kinds of people that we see populating the ticking time bomb scenario theory, we see it is kind of loaded. The dice are loaded. We have rational, calculating bad guys that have no history. The ticking time bomb scenario doesn't tell us who these people are. We know nothing about their history, their background, their feelings, hopes, fears, loves, passions, anxieties, their gender even. We just know that they are the bad guy. And that doesn't tell us very much about who they are, why they're attacking us or coming to get us. And then we also know that ticking time bomb scenarios consequently doesn't tell us if they have a politics. We don't know why they're here. We just simply know they're out to get us, like Darth Vader or Dr. Evil from Austin Powers. And we know that in real life things aren't as simplistic as that. And so what's unifying this conversation that we're having here, this conversation about Walzer, about Beitz, and about ticking time bomb scenario? Well, they are all framings of truth. They are all images of truth, and as a result, they all come to us with certain things at stake, certain costs, advantages to be sure, but also costs. So we can sympathize, perhaps, thinking back about Beitz and Walzer, we can sympathize with Walzer's critique of Beitz, because he's suggesting, much like our critique of ticking time bomb scenario, that it is important to know how the bad guy sees the world and what standards of community he is coming from, where he is coming from. But we know also that Walzer advocates intervention sometimes when certain standards are in place, and we know also that Walzer might be wrong sometimes, that there's times we actually do want to intervene or do use violence to engage in the world. The problem is not here one of suggesting that we need to be peaceful or that we need to be non-violent, but it's simply to suggest that both of these theories come with costs and benefits, but crucially neither theory, neither ticking time bomb scenario, nor Walzer, nor Beitz, thinks about themselves as a framework of thought, thinks about the cost, thinks about the fact that they are a version of truth and not the truth. And Wittgenstein, of course, and this is our conclusion, I guess, for the lecture, what Wittgenstein's trying to do is he's trying to suggest that we not that we should or be for or against a game or situation, but that we need to think about who we are, and we need to think about the space that we are, where the game is taking place, and how these sort of criteria are established in our imagination, and thereby try to embrace a certain mental dexterity, which is, I guess, our punchline for the lecture. So let me move forward now and just sort of, I said at the end of the lecture there would be journal questions, and here they are. These are the questions I would like for you guys to address in your journal writing for Wednesday. First of all, I'd like for you to talk about Antonio Gramsci and his definition of common sense. I would like for you then to discuss Veronique Pinfat and her discussion of the two contending pictures of reason that support the ethics of Beitz and Walzer. Images of truth, as we've just said. Pictures of reason, images of truth. She suggests perhaps that neither theory is really true because, she says, pictures of the problem. And I want to invite you to reflect on that and perhaps think about the pictures we looked at last week and remember that, crucially, what we're trying to sort of flesh out here is this idea that we're so used to what Wittgenstein calls the correspondence theory of truth that we fail to reflect on our own involvement in assessing the truth. We think the truth comes to us from pictures. What the Gestalt images showed us was that, no, in fact, our brains are involved in interpretation of the truth that they offer. And there's different ways of looking at that truth, different stories that come to us as a result of those different types of interpretation. So it's all about mental dexterity, or intellectual dexterity here in relation to this question of ethics, just as last week it was about politics. Then our third question, Wittgenstein, another philosopher, much like Gramsci, argues that truth can hold us captive. Truths can hold us captive. So the question is Wittgenstein saying that there's no ultimate truth or reality out there? I think if you read Veronique Pinfat, you probably find out that that's not the case. So what I want you to do there is to go back and look at whether Wittgenstein's saying there's no standard of truth at all, but maybe perhaps that there's multiple truths. It's not so much that there's no justice, no standard of justice that we can come up with, but that there are multiple standards of justice that need to be contended with at all times. And maybe the truth is never exactly fully possible to nail down, but we know we should know the stakes, and maybe in that there's an answer. So the question 4 then is ticking time bomb scenario relies on several historically non-specific analytic assumptions. The question is, what are these assumptions? What's wrong with them? Here we discussed the lack of a history of the subject of our torture. And then finally, one of the things I assigned for you, if you look in your syllabus for this week, you'll see that I assigned, instead of having supplemental readings for this week, I assigned some videos. And one of those is to a Democracy Now! Video where we see Dick Cheney asserting the idea that waterboarding does produce effective intelligence. And what I want you to do is to think about Ali Soufan, the FBI agent, former FBI agent, and his contradiction of Cheney's views in relation to this. And the question then, of course, being to try to understand whether torture is in fact useful in relation to that. So I hope for you guys to address these questions in your journal, and I'd like to see them on Wednesday, okay? So thanks very much for tuning in, and we leave it at that. That's the end of our lecture for this week, and I hope you have enjoyed this video format and that it's working for you. But as I mentioned the other day, I really desperately need your feedback. So let me know if there's things that I can be doing in these videos that will help you make things a little more clear or elaborate, or if the videos aren't working for you, or if you're having any technological issues, just let me know, okay? And I look forward to seeing you in person on Wednesday. Take care.